Imagine a morning in medieval Europe. You wake up with a splitting headache. No painkillers, no hospitals. The only person who can save you is a doctor holding a knife. He looks at you with confidence and says, "Your blood is in excess." Minutes later, your wrist is sliced. Blood flows incessantly. If you faint, it is a good sign. If you die, it is God's will. For over 1,000 years, humans cured diseases like that. Not because they were cruel, but because they believed it was the only way to survive. And this is the story of an era where medicine was sometimes more dangerous than the disease itself. Medieval medicine, beliefs and bizarre methods. Part 1. When humans cured through faith. Europe on a misty 12th century morning. The church bells toll slowly and steadily, like the breathing of an entire small town just waking up. The damp stone streets, the smell of rotting straw, wood smoke, and body odor mingle to create a heavy, familiar atmosphere. In this era, disease was omnipresent. A mild fever could take a life. A small scratch, if infected, could cause a healthy person to die in agony after just a few days. Humans lived with death as an inevitable part of life, and they sought to explain it through everything they believed in: God, demons, the stars, and invisible imbalances within the body. Medieval medicine did not lack doctors. On the contrary, they were very confident. Clad in long robes, carrying parchment books, and quoting ancient scholars, they walked with the air of those holding supreme knowledge. In the eyes of commoners, they were almost like prophets. But ironically, many of their treatments were as dangerous as, or even more dangerous than, the disease they were trying to cure. The four humors, the foundation of all therapy. To understand medieval medicine, one must start with a core belief. The human body was operated by four types of fluids. This theory originated from ancient Greek physicians, especially Galen, and was considered absolute truth for over 1,000 years. Those four humors were: blood, representing life, warmth, and joy; phlegm, associated with cold, moisture, and lethargy; yellow bile, hot, dry, and angry; black bile, cold, dry, and melancholy. A healthy human was someone whose four humors were in perfect balance. Any symptom, from headaches, high fevers, and nausea to depression or nightmares, was explained by a very simple conclusion: a certain humor is in excess. And once the excess humor was identified, the medieval doctor did not hesitate. They intervened directly in the body, with absolute certainty that they were doing the right thing. Bloodletting, when blood became the enemy. The treatment session began in a dark room, where light only filtered through a narrow slit in the door. The patient was asked to sit or lie still, sleeves rolled high, face pale with anxiety. The doctor took out a small tool, sharp as a razor, a lancet. No anesthesia, no sterilization, just a decisive cut into the vein. Blood began to flow. For medieval people, blood was not merely life, but also the source of many diseases. Fever, excess blood; headache, excess blood; anxiety, excess blood. Even excessive love could be seen as a result of hot blood. The more blood flowed, the more satisfied the doctor became. If the patient began to feel dizzy or lightheaded, it was a good sign. If they fainted, it was a very good sign. The poison is leaving the body. Balance is being restored. No one knew exactly how much blood was enough to draw. Usually, until the patient could no longer endure it. Many people did not die from the disease, but from acute blood loss. But that death was rarely blamed on the doctor. Instead, people believed that God did not want them to live any longer. Leeches, the scary, natural therapy. If bloodletting with a knife was too violent, the doctor had another option, considered gentler and more natural. Leeches. Dark, slippery leeches were kept in glass jars, always wriggling slowly. It was believed that leeches had the ability to suck exactly the amount of blood needed, no more, no less. The doctor placed each one onto the patient's skin. They latched on, bit through the skin, and began to suck. Initially, the patient felt only a slight sting. Then coldness. Then they gradually weakened. There were treatment cases using dozens of leeches at once. When the leeches were full of blood, they bloated and fell off, leaving small wounds that bled for hours. The problem was, the patient was already weak from the illness. Losing more blood only made them waste away faster. But in the eyes of a medieval doctor, if the patient became weaker, it only proved that the therapy was on the right track. When poisons became medicine, not just blood, medieval medicine also believed that toxins, if used correctly, could cure diseases. One of the most famous miracles was mercury. Mercury was commonly used to treat syphilis, a disease spreading throughout Europe. Patients were smeared with, drank, or inhaled mercury vapors for many consecutive days. The results were very clear: uncontrolled drooling, loss of teeth, hand tremors, mental disorders. But instead of stopping, the doctor declared, the medicine is taking effect. The symptoms of poisoning were seen as evidence of successful treatment. Similarly, arsenic, a famous killer, was also used as a tonic because it caused strong reactions, body heat, sweating, and a rapid heartbeat. For medieval medicine, the more intense the sensation, the more effective the medicine was. Part 2. Trepanation, Demons, and Remedies from the Dead. In the Middle Ages, when a person suffered from persistent headaches, seizures, delirium, or unusual behavior, people did not immediately think of neurological pathologies. The more common, simpler, and more terrifying explanation was, something that does not belong to humans is inside their head. It could be a demon. It could be an evil spirit. Or it could be an evil pressure building up inside the skull. To solve that problem, medieval medicine offered a method that makes modern people shudder just hearing about it. Trepanation, when the head becomes a door for demons to escape. The patient was taken into an empty room. No anesthesia, no numbing, no form of pain relief whatsoever. Their head was held tight, or they were forced to sit still, while the doctor held a tool that looked like a primitive metal drill. The sound of metal scraping against bone rang out dryly. Slowly, turn by turn, trepanation was the act of creating a hole directly in the skull bone, piercing through the brain's final layer of protection. It was believed that once the hole was opened, the cause of the disease, whether toxic air, evil forces, or demons, would have a way to escape. Blood flowed heavily. Pain was inevitable, but in the mind of a medieval doctor, pain was not the issue. Pain was even seen as necessary, as it showed the body was reacting. There were patients who survived trepanation. They became living proof of the effectiveness of this method. But there were also many others who never woke up again. Infection, hemorrhage, brain damage, all could occur, but when the patient died, the explanation was always ready: the demon was too strong. God's will did not allow them to be healed. No one questioned the method. They only questioned fate. Medicine for the rich, when gemstones were used for drinking. Not everyone had to endure brutal therapies like bloodletting or trepanation. The wealthy, the aristocracy, had more refined ways of healing. They believed that gemstones carried the energy of the universe. Emeralds helped cool the liver. Rubies enhanced vitality. Sapphires protected against evil vapors. The usage was simple: grind the gemstones into powder, then mix it into water to drink. Stones once seen as symbols of power and wealth now flowed down human stomachs as medicine. No one knew what effect they actually had. But faith was very strong. The more expensive the drink, the more miraculous the medicine. Egyptian mummies, when death became a remedy. There was something even more precious than gemstones in medieval medicine: Egyptian mummies. Europeans believed that mummies contained an ancient energy capable of healing all ailments, from headaches to internal bleeding. Mummies were imported to Europe, crushed, then mixed into medicine. People drank mummy powder like a tonic, believing the power of the dead would transfer to the living. Few knew, or wanted to know, that many mummies on the market were actually just ordinary dried human corpses, even criminals or slaves. But that did not matter. What mattered was the belief that death could cure life. Animal excrement, when desperation took over. For the poor, medicine had no gemstones or mummies. They used what was available. Cow dung, dog feces, pigeon droppings, all were used as poultices. It was believed that animal excrement contained heat and vital energy that could draw toxins out of a wound. These mixtures were applied directly to open skin, ulcers, or even deep wounds. The stench was overwhelming. Flies swarmed thickly. Infection was almost certain. But once again, if the patient died, the fault never lay with the method. Medieval doctors, the people WHO, were never wrong. The most terrifying thing about medieval medicine was not the knives, the leeches, or the trepanation. It was the absolute certainty. Doctors believed they understood the human body. They believed they were doing the right thing. They believed all pain had meaning. And when belief becomes truth, there is no room for doubt. People of that time did not die from a lack of medicine. They died because they never asked questions. Part 3. When medicine had to follow the will of God and the stars. In the Middle Ages, the human body did not belong to humans. It belonged to God. It belonged to the cosmic order. And it was directly influenced by the sky above their heads. Therefore, healing was not just a matter of scalpels or herbs. It was a ritual, an intervention into the divine order. Illness was not always just an illness. When a person fell ill, the first question was not, what is wrong with them? But rather, what sin have they committed? Medieval people believed that illness was often a punishment from God. A fever could be a warning. A prolonged illness could be a sign that the soul had fallen. Thus, many treatment courses began not at a clinic, but at a church. Patients were required to pray, fast, confess, atone through physical pain. There were those who believed that the more they suffered, the sooner God would forgive them. In that context, brutal treatments were even easier to accept. They did not just cure the disease, but also washed away sin. Astrology, when the scalpel had to ask the sky for permission. Medieval doctors never treated a disease arbitrarily. They had to consult the stars. Each part of the human body was thought to be governed by a planet. The heart belonged to the sun. The brain belonged to the moon. The liver was influenced by Jupiter. The blood was linked to Mars. If you had a headache, the problem did not just lie within the skull. It could be because the moon was in an unfavorable position. Bloodletting? The right day had to be chosen. Trepanation? The right hour had to be chosen. If performed at the wrong time, doctors believed they themselves would disrupt the cosmic order, causing the patient to die faster. Therefore, there were those who died while waiting until the stars permitted them to be treated. Herbs, magic, and the old women on the fringes of society. Not everyone believed in doctors. In the countryside, people sought out herbs, charms, and old women who understood plants. They used roots, dried leaves, and decoctions, which were sometimes more effective than orthodox methods. But these women were considered dangerous. They did not study at medical schools. They did not quote ancient books. And worst of all, they cured people. In a society where medical power was tightly bound to religion and men, that was unacceptable. Many folk healers were accused of witchcraft. Herbal knowledge gradually disappeared, not because it was wrong, but because it was not allowed to exist. Medicine stood still out of fear. There was one thing that medieval medicine almost never did: dissect human corpses. The human body was viewed as sacred. Cutting open a corpse was considered an insult to God. Therefore, knowledge of anatomy was based mainly on ancient books, not actual observation. If a book said the liver was shaped like this, then that is how it had to be. If reality differed, then reality was wrong. Mistakes were not corrected. Doubt was not encouraged. And medicine stood still for centuries. When humans accepted pain as a part of life, medieval people were born in pain, grew up amidst disease, and died much earlier than modern humans. They did not expect to be cured. They only hoped to endure better. In that world, medicine was not a science. It was a faith. And when faith is strong enough, humans can accept anything, including letting others drain their blood, drill their skulls, or feed them poison, with the fragile hope that they would live just a little bit longer. Part 4. 1,000 Years of Errors, and Why No One Dared to Fix Them. There is a question that modern people often wonder about. If medieval medicine was so dangerous, why did it persist for over 1,000 years? The answer does not lie in ignorance. It lies in fear. Knowledge becomes inviolable scripture. In medieval society, knowledge was not something to be debated. It was something to be believed. Ancient medical books were treated like Bibles. The names of ancient scholars were considered infallible. If a young doctor dared to say, perhaps bloodletting does not make the patient healthier, he was not just refuting a method. He was challenging the entire order of knowledge. And in a society where religion, power, and academia were tightly bound together, that was an extremely dangerous act. Doctors were not blamed, only patients were chosen. When a patient died after treatment, it never proved that the method was wrong. Instead, people said, the disease arrived too late. The patient's body was too weak. Faith was not strong enough. It was God's predetermined will. This way of thinking created an unbreakable loop. The method was never wrong. Only humans were not worthy enough to be saved. The fear of change. Change meant admitting that those who came before were wrong. Millions of people may have died in vain. An entire belief system needed to collapse. That was something medieval society was not ready to face. So, they chose the safer path, to continue doing what they had always done, even when it killed. Deaths that were not meaningless. But history does not stand still forever. Though slow, though full of pain, those mistakes still left traces. Some doctors began to notice. Why did patients grow weaker after bloodletting? Why did many die of infection after surgery? Why were folk herbs sometimes more effective than orthodox medicine? Initially, these questions were only whispered. In closed rooms, among those who dared to think differently. The moment of the first doubt. A major change does not come from a great invention. It comes from a small doubt. Is this truly correct? When humans began to look at the body instead of just reading books, when they began to observe instead of just believing, medicine, for the first time, moved forward. But the price to pay was immense. Those who asked questions were considered heretics, banned from teaching, threatened, even executed. The truth is, for many centuries, medicine did not develop because it was held back by human fear itself. When pain becomes a legacy, every incision, every trepanation, every dose of mercury, is a part of history. Not the history of war or royalty, but the history of anonymous people, those who believed they were being healed, while in reality, they were becoming lessons for the future. Part 5, Conclusion, when humans finally dared to look directly at their bodies. There is no single date recorded in history stating, today, medieval medicine officially ended. Its collapse was not loud. There was no revolution. There were no signaling bells. It faded slowly, like an old belief gradually losing its footing in the human mind. When humans began to see the connection, there came a point when more and more people realized something simple yet dangerous. Patients who were not bled too much lived longer. Wounds that were kept clean became infected less often. Surgeries performed quickly and neatly resulted in fewer deaths. Initially, these realizations were not called science. They were merely survival experiences. People began to whisper to one another, perhaps not all pain carries meaning. Dissection, ANACT, forbidden yet unstoppable. Then there were those who dared to do what was previously considered blasphemy, dissecting dead human bodies. Not to insult God, but to understand life. For the first time, humans saw that the liver did not have the shape described in books. Blood vessels did not operate according to ancient descriptions. The body was much more complex than anything they had ever believed. Each time an error was discovered, an entire worldview shook. Medicine no longer based on faith, but on evidence. The greatest change did not lie in scalpels or medicines. It lay in how humans asked questions. It was no longer, what does the book say? But rather, what does reality show? It was no longer, what does God want? But rather, how does the body react? Medicine, finally, stepped out of the shadows of blind faith. Those whose names were not recorded. The history of modern medicine often remembers scientists and pioneering doctors. But it rarely mentions the patients bled until they fainted. Those who died of infections after trepanation. The children who drank mercury because adults believed it was medicine. They have no names in textbooks. But they are the foundation. Every death was an unanswered question. And it was those very questions that forced humanity to change. The final lesson of medieval medicine. Medieval medicine is not just a story of backwardness. It is a story of unverified belief. People of that time were not ignorant. They simply believed too firmly in what they were taught, to the point of not daring to doubt. And that is a timeless lesson. When a system believes it cannot be wrong, it is that very system that will cause the most suffering. A concluding word for today's listeners. Today, we live in an era of modern medicine. Medicines, surgeries, technology have saved millions of lives. But every time you hear about a miraculous method, an unverified therapy, a belief proclaimed as absolute truth. Remember the Middle Ages. Remember that there was once a time when humans believed that to cure a disease, one had to cut veins, drill skulls, and drink poison. Not because they were evil, but because they had never been permitted to ask questions.